Tonight's guest is Dr. Woody Holton. His complete resume was posted, so I'm just going to hit the highlights. By the way, his credentials are fantastic. He has a BA in English from UVA and a PhD in history from Duke. He was a professor at the University of Richmond, and he currently is a professor at the University of South Carolina. He is an award-winning author, so I hope you look at all those awards. There's so many to mention. He's written 3 books: Unruly Americans and the Origin of the Constitution, Black Americans in the Revolutionary Era, A Brief History with Documents, and of course, Abigail Adams. Now, I've heard that we can look forward to reading another book, The Fire Beneath, The Hidden History of the American Revolution, which is in production. So Dr. Holton, I have a few questions for you that you can answer throughout the evening. And if you don't answer them, I'll hit you with them at the end. But these are just to have in your mind. I want to know about you. How do you choose, what format do you choose to write? From notes, do you have hard copy all around you? Do you work late at night or consumed and on a schedule? Of all the historical American women, you'll probably tell us tonight why Abigail Adams. Where did you read all the letters? Were they difficult to read? Did you get to touch the letters? And I'll say the last one, I'll ask you this one for sure again. Would you want Abigail Adams to be your friend had you lived at that time? So those are things for you to think about. So now I'm turning it over to you, and we're just going to, oh, one more thing, pick a number between 1 and 480.
Me?
Yes, you, our guest.
Did you want me to pick one?
1 to 480.
Yeah, my guess is 240.
240. Okay, I'll tell that person later. Okay, Dr. Holton, Woody, it is yours.
Okay. Hey, thanks everybody for signing on. I know this is a lot harder than being in the same room. And thank you, Cindy, for those wonderful questions, most of which I'm not going to answer, but in my standard spiel, but you make me desirous to shorten my standard spiel so I can, so we can take those on, because those are great questions that we should all have to answer and that I'd enjoy taking on with you. So, so ask those at the end if I don't cover them, because I don't think I will in my standard spiel. But
okay.
I have to say there's a lot of advantages of this. Oh, is everybody hearing me okay? I heard somebody peeping. Hey, Cindy and Colleen, if you guys don't mind letting me see you while I'm talking, it'll make sure we're still connected. But I know I can't see all 100 people.
I can do that.
You don't have to, guys. Maybe one. Maybe diapering a baby or something, in which case we don't. Okay.
It's nice to get a reaction.
Well, I can't answer your question about how I got, yes, exactly, into this project. I was doing my previous book on the origins of the Constitution and got interested in something that I won't go into today because it can be boring, and that is bond speculation. And you'll see in a second how that suddenly became related to Abigail Adams. But let me start with plugging my book a little. By the way, you can get it on if you don't mind reading Kindle books, they've got it for $1.99 at Kindle. So there's my only plug, because it's like, because it's so cheap for the once I'm close to the top of the bestseller list in Kindle books only. So go plug $1.99 unless you hate Kindle, like I know a lot of people do. But let's get started.
We do have a quick question.
I want to ask you kind of a question. Sure.
We do have a couple people who are wondering about signed copies. So if that's ever available, if you could please provide us a link or a way to do that, we'd be happy to share as well.
Oh, okay. Let me go ahead and answer that now. Yeah, since I can't sign the Kindle. I'll give you, depending on how many people are on at the end of the, well, I'll go ahead and give it to you now. I trust you guys. I'll give you my address if somebody really wants a signed copy. I don't have a system, but if you'll mail me a copy with a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll sign it and write whatever you want in the front of it and send it right back to you. And here's my address. anonymous hordes of people watching this.
Well, you can,
Here's
you know
where I
what, you can
live.
email, you can
5
email it to me.
Charlie.
Just email your address to me and I'll
Okay,
post
and then
it.
you can
I
send
mean,
it
I'll
out.
have them contact me. We'll do it that way. And then you won't have to reveal it to the world.
Do that. Let's not waste time on it. Okay, good. Well, everybody knows whose house this is. You know that George Washington, of course, died at Mount Vernon, his beautiful house on the Potomac. But you know, his 3 successors as president of the United States, Adams at the top there, Jefferson at Monticello on the left, and Madison at Montpelier on the right. That is, so the second, third, and fourth presidents, they all died in these beautiful mansions, but there's a difference between them because 2 out of those 3 mansions had to be sold just to pay the Jefferson's and Madison's debts. Contrast Jefferson and Madison to John Adams, the second president, who died in a mansion, didn't have to sell it. In fact, it stayed in the Adams family until it entered the public domain where it is now. What's the difference? How did he manage to die rich and not in debt, whereas the other 2 died so deep in debt? Now, John Adams will answer that question by saying, I'm a better lawyer than them. But there's a different, and I think better answer to that question about why John Adams died wealthy and debt-free, and that answer can be provided in 2 words, and those words are Abigail Adams. And I want to take you to the decade between 1774 and 1784, when the Adams were living first in one of those 2 houses in Braintree and then in the other. But during that decade, it was in many ways the worst decade of Abigail Adams's life. And actually, Cindy, she described it as my widowhood. She was not literally a widow, but she felt like one because her husband, John, was first 300 miles away in Philadelphia most of the time at the Continental Congress, quick visits, and then 3,000 miles away in France as an American diplomat in France. And so emotionally, this was the worst decade of her life. She was never a real widow because John Adams, her husband, outlived her by 8 years, but she called it her widowhood. Terrible time for her emotionally, as you can see in their letters. And to answer one of your questions, every single letter that John and Abigail Adams wrote to each other is now available online to anybody. And you just Google Adams Electronic Archive, and you can read all 2,000 of them if you want to. And actually, if you don't trust, you know, they type them up for you, transcribe them. But if you don't trust their transcription, you can then click and read the actual original letter. It's not easy, but it is fun. And so for the bulk of what I was doing, I have to confess that it was a pretty easy job. I could read online, and I read online in all sorts of strange places, you know, airport waiting rooms and so forth. On the other hand, a lot of their other correspondence, some of it is only available in a lot of other letters that she wrote. She wrote more than 2,000 letters, about half to John and half to other people. And a lot of those letters, I did get to touch the actual letter that she wrote and hold her signature in my hand, which was a real thrill. But most of it's also on microfilm, and most of those other letters that she wrote are also available online. You can get them indirectly through the website I gave you. Like, just Google Adams Electronic Archives or Adams Family Papers. Any of those will get you to the same place. But anyway, so she wrote these mournful letters to her husband for those 10 years, basically saying, "Come home." Because
May I interrupt a minute?
Sure.
There is a question. What was the site again for the letters?
I think the best thing to Google is Adams Electronic Archive. Okay. I'm still trying to make one big point here, is that emotionally, this was the worst decade of her life. Economically, it was the best decade in the life of the Adams family, because John Adams had to turn the family farm, which you see here, over to Abigail. and she ran it much better than he ever had. She was not much of a farmer, but she found 3 other ways to really expand the Adams fortune in her husband's absence. And I want to talk about all 3 of them because there's a larger message here, because she was one of only thousands. She was only one of thousands of American women, Native American women, as well as whites, who during the Revolution, their husbands had to go off to war. And so the women were left running things. And some of them did a worse job than their husband did, but many of them did an amazing job. And she's one of those examples. So how'd she do it? Well, let me begin the first with a blockade. During the Revolutionary War, the British Navy tried to blockade the rebel colonies. They were already boycotting British merchandise, but the British didn't want them trading with France either. So they had a line of ships here. And look, I can even make my ships move, because that's what they would do, is patrol up and down, trying, oh, but here's a ship coming over from France, trying to get past the blockade. Can he do it? Oh, yes, he made it around the end and got through to Boston. But that was rare, because it was a pretty good blockade, not as good as Lincoln would put up around the South in the Civil War, but it was a pretty effective blockade. The reason I mention this is that Abigail found a way to profit from it, because by 1778, John is over in France and he's getting a decent salary. And like any good husband, he wants to send half of it home to his family. And he wrote Abigail saying, well, there's this thing called the bill of exchange, so I'll send these pieces of paper over to you and you can turn them into cash over there and buy groceries. And Abigail wrote back saying, okay, we can do it that way if you want to, but I have a better idea. And that is, because of the British blockade, any goods that did make it through could be sold at an enormous markup, because the store shelves were empty because of the blockade. And so Abigail said to John, don't send me these bills of exchange, basically like today's bank checks. Don't send me paper, send me stuff, especially women's clothing. And I will mark it up enormously and sell it here in Massachusetts and make a huge profit. And so you'll basically be sending me a lot more money if you send it in the form of merchandise. And John went along with that idea and sent her a bunch of stuff to sell. And she was right. She did make a tremendous profit at it. And it really changed the relationship between John and Abigail Adams. And I can illustrate that change this way. And maybe some people online with us tonight have been through this experience where one spouse wants to buy a new vehicle and the other spouse says, as I say of our 20-year-old Volvo, hey, it still rolls. Well, John Adams wanted to keep with the carriage they already had, but Abigail was embarrassed to drive around on this thing. So they'd gone back and forth on whether to buy a new carriage. But then when on his very first trip to Europe, at her request, he sent her a bunch of Barcelona handkerchiefs, which women wore around their necks in those days. You know, they weren't for sneezing into, they were a real high fashion item. And it was, you know, it was the Gucci purses of the day. And so people gobbled them up. And here's the point. Abigail was now able to go out and buy that carriage, A, because John's all the way over in France, but B, because she was able to do it with her own money, the money that he'd sent her in the form of handkerchiefs that she sold. Now, this is all well and good, but John discovered how risky it was when one of his shipments was captured by the British. And he said, I burnt my fingers and I'm gonna stop sending you any more things because that one, you know, we got nothing off of that one. And Abigail wrote back, ever the dutiful 18th century wife, and said, okay, dear, if you want to get out of this business, we can, but do you realize, I'll quote her, if 1 in 3 arrives, I will be a gainer. That is, the British could capture 2 out of the 3 ships you send me, but I'll make so much money on the 3rd one that it'll be worthless. And 1 of 3 arrives, I should be a gainer, which I take it as the kind of 18th century version of, you just don't get it, do you, John? Yes, the risk is great, but correspondingly, so is the reward. John proposed kind of a compromise, which was, well, let me at least spread the risk. So instead of sending you these huge shipments once a year or so, every little vessel that sets out from France going to America, I'll ask somebody on it to take, a chest of stuff over to you. And Abigail wrote back in response to that proposal, okay, I see your point there too. That would be spreading the risks. But if you're going to do it that way, just send me a small chest at a time, that will mean that you're having to go out and buy this stuff retail because you don't have a warehouse. So in order to fill these chests, you're going to have to go to the shops. And you got to buy wholesale, man. You got to buy wholesale. That's where the money is. And once again, to his great credit, John Adams, who had never expressed much interest in her women's rights advocacy on the grand scale, like when she said, remember the ladies, he wrote back, I cannot but laugh. So in some way we'd call him a sexist pig, but in his personal life where his bank account was concerned, he was smart enough to listen to his spouse. And actually, eventually, he just let her correspond directly with the merchants of Paris and Amsterdam, and everybody was happier that way. And she really made him a fortune in this overseas trade. But it's only one of the things that she did. This was a longer term investment. You see this map of New England. Many of you can recognize the finger that looks like it's saying, come here. That's Cape Cod. And so there's a bay north of there, the deepest bay. North of there is where Boston, oh, actually, I think I have Boston marked on there. Yeah, there's Boston. Well, while Abigail and John were living in eastern Massachusetts, other New Englanders were settling the area that we now call Vermont. But New Hampshire said, no, you're not, because that whole area is part of New York. And so there was a big land battle going on. You've all heard of Ethan Allen representing the Vermonters, and they were battling the New Yorkers. Well, can you see way up at the top of my map there, Lake Memphremagog. You've all heard of Lake Champlain, which is over there near the L from my writing, Lake Memphremagog, but there's a smaller lake way at the tip top. They call it North Country because it's so far north. You're almost in Canada. In fact, most of that lake is in Canada. But anyway, some of these people who were scheming up this new state of Vermont also had land titles to sell. And they came and visited Abigail. They knew she was making money in this merchant business and said, would you like to buy some land? Get in on the ground floor, as they say. And she said, what's the minimum amount? And what's the maximum amount of acres you'll let me buy? That was 330 acres. And so she said, I'll take 5. And they go, no. Each person in any individual town can only buy 330. She goes, yeah, but I'll take 5, one in the name of my husband, one in the name of each of my 3 sons. And she even bought one in the name of her daughter because her daughter was not yet married. The one person in the Adams family that she didn't buy one of these tracts of 330 acres each, adding up to 1,650 acres. Do you know who the one person in her family that she didn't buy land in the name of? Herself, because she's a married woman. It's the 18th century, and actually well into the 19th century. It's not like the revolution got rid of this. Women, once they were married, were basically dead in the eyes of the law. They couldn't own property. They couldn't buy and sell things. They couldn't be sued. They couldn't write wills, and so forth. And so she bought these 1,658 acres worth of land, which was the maximum that she could, because that's how many family members she had. And then she wrote John with great trepidation, because she said, I have my heart set upon this. So there's a little bit of emotional manipulation going on. She said, dear, are you really going to tell me to not do something I have my heart set upon? But she said, but she also realized this was a deep speculation. That land might end up being worth nothing, because if it ends up being adjudicated over to New York and not this new state of Vermont, then she gets 0 for her money. So she wrote, I fear you will think I have gone Vermont mad. And that's exactly what he thought. and he wrote her in no uncertain terms, don't meddle anymore with Vermont. And she didn't for a while. But then a couple years later, her father died, leaving her 200 acres. Now, when a man dies, leaves land to his daughter, which it didn't often do, but he did, and leaves land to his daughter, it really goes to her husband to control during his lifetime. But the one power that the wife had was that he couldn't sell land without her approval. That's the one power that married women had economically with respect to land, was this veto on sales. And so Abigail saw that as an opportunity. She wrote John saying, look, I know you don't want this land that our father left it. It's in an inconvenient place. So I know you want to sell this land, and I'll sign off on you selling it. But she wrote, let me get the exact line, I will exchange with you. She was offering to exchange her signature, signing off on selling the land he wanted to get rid of in Massachusetts, but only in exchange for him agreeing to her buying more land in Vermont. I will exchange with you. You can't get any farther than the Adams had from the 18th century ideal of a patriarchal marriage where the man calls the shots. She's actually, my wife and I make deals all the time. There's nothing unique about that in the 21st century, but that wasn't how it was supposed to operate in the 18th, but that's where they had evolved to by 1783. Okay, so I told you about two ways that she made him wealthy: Vermont land and trading with the French across that British blockade. A third one is illustrated by this this bond. Today we think of bonds as a conservative investment, but they weren't when she bought this bond, this consolidated note. You know that George Washington was not able to pay his troops in real money because he didn't have it. And so essentially he paid them instead in IOUs. And that's also how they paid for merchandise in the Revolutionary War. And they also sold a bunch of bonds similar to savings bonds to raise cash for the Continental Congress and for the state legislatures. Well, the thing to know about these bonds is that they quickly depreciated. That is, a bond like this one, which was initially for 100, a consolidated note, it's called, essentially initially for $100, or actually, I'm sorry, livre tournois, which is a French coin, initially for $100. It's trading at a fourth of its face value, or about 24 pounds, or 24 livre tournois. And so here's the thing, though. So she was able to buy it at a fourth of the face value. That's a pretty good discount if you're at a clothing store to get 75% off. She got 75% off. But the key thing I want to tell you is that this bond paid 6% interest, which is not bad, but it paid 6% interest on the face value of the bond. So do a little math with me here. I'm just to say dollars to simplify this. Her bond has a face value of $100, but she paid $24 for the bond, and she's getting interest every year. 6% of $100 is $6. So here's the math question. Her $6 that she gets every year, divide that by 24, and you can tell me what her annual rate of return. It's just 6 divided by 24. Cindy, you want to take a stab at it? Or Colleen, you're a tech genius. Are you a math genius too?
No, but I have a calculator.
You have, okay.
Or we can ask the people in the Q&A, just put your answer in.
If they can answer that, or the
Yeah, see if
Q&A,
they can
whatever.
answer it.
All right, so we'll leave that hanging
If
out.
anyone pops it, I know what the answer is now because I did the math, but the first person, I'll announce the first person who puts it in the Q&A.
Oh, that's fun. Okay, good. I'll tell you for the moment, it's high. She made a killing on these bonds. And but there was only one problem that she had with all this money she was making for John Adams during the Revolutionary War as a bond speculator. And that one problem was John Adams, because he saw bond speculators as basically crooks. Because this is money that was paid out to the soldiers or to the people who had supplied livestock and grain and other things to the army. And now it's trading at a fraction of its face value, and the taxpayers are paying this interest. This money is actually coming from France. So in a sense, even worse, we're taking this money that the French are supposed to be helping us buy guns, not enrich speculators. And so he hated the speculators. He hated them both as a patriot, and he also hated them as a personal investor, because he was a very conservative investor. His favorite thing to invest in was land. And many of you probably have read Gone with the Wind. This is not in the movie version, but in the book version, Scarlett O'Hara's father says to him, "Land, Scarlett, that's the only thing worth fighting for and dying for, land." And we think of this as this old South thing, the joy of owning land, because the enemy can come and they can burn your house and they can burn your farm, but they can't burn the land under it. So it's the safe investment. It gives you independence and security, all that. And we think of it as a Southern patriarchal, whatever thing, but John Adams, even though he was a New Englander, he was a very conservative investment. And so when Abigail would talk about, when he finally found out, is a better way to put it, about her bond speculation, he said, no, switch the land. And there was one piece of land near his house he wanted to buy. And she said, "Okay, I'll buy that land if you want me to, but your annual return on that land by renting it out is going to be 1% a year. And I can get you more." And how much more, Colleen? Did somebody answer the question yet?
Yes, so Corinne Keys Fairfax answered first, and it was 25%.
Yeah, I can get you 25% annual return on your investment every single year. So you've got John, the conservative investor who wants to get land, and Abigail, the much more risky investor who wants to instead buy bonds. This battle between them kind of came to a head after she finally joined him in Europe. This was after the war was over. He then became, he's going to eventually become the first American ambassador to the court of St. James, that is to England. But while he was still in France, she came over and joined him. And I want to show you a photocopy of a letter that John wrote to, I know you can't read it. Actually, I think I have a copy of it on here. Yeah, there it is. Now, this is 18th century handwriting, and I know how hard that is. He's writing his business agent. He's in Paris in April 1785. By this time, Abigail has joined him, okay? And he's writing his business agent saying, "I've got 300 pounds coming to me, and this is how I want to invest them." And I bet if I read the orange part, many of you will be able to read along with me. "You may draw upon me to the amount of 300 pounds when you please." And draw upon me means draw a check on my account. "Draw upon me to the amount of 300 pounds when you please, and also to pay for Vesey's place, if he will sell it reasonably," and so forth. So here's the point. John's got 300 pounds coming to him. He writes on the front page of this letter to Abigail, to his business agent back in Boston, who happens to be Abigail's uncle, "Take that 300 pounds that I've got coming and use it to buy me some land near my house." That's what it says on the front of this letter. But if you flip the letter over to the back, and I'll do that for you guys here. Let's zoom back out. Oh, yes, sir. I even have video of it flipping over if it works. Take that same letter and flip it over to the back. Here's what John wrote as he was closing this letter. "Shewing what I had written to Madam, she has made me sick of purchasing Vesey's place. Instead of that, therefore, you may draw upon me for 200 pounds at as good an exchange as you can obtain, and lay it out in such notes as you judge most for my interest. Notes are bonds. And Abigail had convinced him in the middle of writing this letter to switch from wanting to buy land on page 1 to wanting to buy what she wants, which is bonds on the back page. So I can imagine him actually, I don't know if this will work on video, but he's sitting there trying to get this letter finished. Did you finish the letter quickly before Abigail comes around, and then she comes up behind him and looks over his shoulder and says, "You're not going to waste another 300 pounds on that worthless, sandy, rocky New England soil, are you? Please buy bonds." And Madam convinced him to do what she wanted, which turned out to be a very profitable thing for him. So that she continued to make this enormous interest. That was one bond, 25%, some were more, some were less. But then she cashed out these bonds at 90% of their face value after the Constitution was adopted. Now, remember, she paid, in general, about 25% of face value, and she cashed out at 90% of face value. So even more so than with the merchandising and with the buying Vermont land, which that was a long-term investment that didn't really become valuable until the 19th century. Where she really made money was as a bond speculator. So what did she do with all this money? Well, I wrote my biography. You asked about my process. I did have to do a lot of it on microfilm, and I just went through these hundreds of reels of microfilm chronologically and came to her will. I can't remember whether I zoomed in on that or not. No, let me go back. And this is Abigail Adams's will, which I'm sorry it's smaller here, but let me read some of that to you. And again, I'm just going through chronologically. She wrote this will in 1816 when she thought she was dying. She actually lived for 2 more years till 1818. And then you probably know that her husband famously died 8 years after that in 1826. So anyway, she's writing her will. It goes like this. I, Abigail Adams, wife of the Honorable John Adams of Quincy in the county of Norfolk, bind with his consent to dispose of the following property, blah, blah, blah. And, lots of people have written great biographies of Abigail Adams, and everybody mentions the will, and then you're almost done. You then mention her death and all the commemorations and so forth. And I was about to do the same. That is, write up her will, and then a couple more chapters, or maybe one more chapter and I'm finished. But there was something bothering me about Abigail Adams's will, disposing of her property. And let's ask the Q&A. That was too much fun. Let's see if anybody can ring in and tell us can you figure out in a few minutes or a few seconds what took me a couple of days? Because I'm scratching my head. It's like these detective shows where Monk or somebody goes, wait a minute, there's something bothering me here. Is there anything bothering you about Abigail Adams's will? Colleen, has anybody rung in on that one already? It's probably, nobody can type that fast.
Not yet, but woman couldn't write a will is the first. Penny Switzer has come in with that women couldn't write a will. Jane Wood has offered that John honored it, which is hard to do because I think John died before her. Then we have Susan saying that no money was given to male relatives.
Susan's read the book. Thank you, Susan. But you're also stepping on my punchline, Susan. Thanks a lot. Hey,
and yes, more on the women can't own property and give it away.
That's the key. Women, married women. Now, if you are a single woman, which almost nobody never married. So if you're a single woman or a widow, then you have basically the same property rights as men. Now, unfortunately, if you and I get into a lawsuit, I'm a married man and you're a widow, we have the same legal rights theoretically, but it's going to be an all-male jury and a male judge. So you may not have the same property rights as a man in practice, but technically a widow has the same property rights as a man. And it's incorrect to say that John Adams died after her. That John Adams died before her. John died after her. So Abigail Adams was never a widow. And so she's a married woman till the day she died. So she's not allowed to own property. If you can't own property, you can't give property away. That is, women weren't supposed to write wills. And yet she did it anyway. I will tell you that since the book came out, a few people have found a small number of other instances of other married women just defying the law and writing wills despite not being supposed to do it. But to me, what's exciting about this is that she had failed in her effort to get the laws changed on behalf of women. But what she had done is turned her own household into sort of a demonstration project of what would it be like if we had equitable laws? Let's just give it a shot. And she had taken some of this money that she had made for her husband as a bond speculator and set it aside and called it her own. She called it my pocket money, my own money. My favorite phrase, because it really shows up the ambiguity of it, is she called it this money which I call mine. Because she knew the law written by men didn't agree with her, but I call mine. And she used it often for things that John didn't approve of, charities that she was more excited about than him, for instance. She especially used it to bribe her children to come live near her. Oh, there's a house near ours, and I know you don't have a lot of money right now, but we'll pay half of it. I will pay half of it if you'll come live near me. My favorite use of it is from, remember that Vesey farm that they were fighting over whether to buy in 1785? That actually came on the market a couple of years earlier. And there's this great letter that Abigail wrote John in 1783. So I'm going back in time a little bit here. 1783, John is still in France. Abigail is still in Massachusetts, and he really wanted Vesey's farm. And she wrote him a letter saying, oh, good. Vesey's farm is on the market, so you can go ahead and buy it if you want, but there's a problem. You don't have enough money in your account to buy Vesey's farm. She says there's a problem, but there's also a solution, because I know somewhere you can borrow the money. All right, let's go to the guest board again. Who can guess where Abigail was going to go out and borrow this money? You've changed, Cindy, the way I do these lectures from now until the end of the virus, which I hope will be tomorrow. This is a lot more fun than the way I do this with an audience. All right, so let's see how quick somebody can guess.
So
where
Corinne,
borrow this money.
our first answer, Corinne came back with from herself. Exactly.
She had this stash of money that she could. Now, here's what she said. But it wasn't, I'm gonna do this. It's, I might do this if quid can meet quo. And here's what she wrote. If my dear friend, as she always called him, if my dear friend, you will promise to come home, take the farm into your own hands and improve it, and let me turn dairywoman, then she said, I can lend you this 100 pounds. So only if he came home from France and ended her misery of being without him, only on that condition would she lend him the money. And actually, John did not come home, and she didn't lend the money. And that's why the Vesey farm was still out there for them to fight over 2 years later, once he was in Paris. All right, so let me say just a couple more things about that will, and then I want to try the questions that you gave me and also some of these others. But here's the other things I want to say about the will. How much did she leave? Well, $5,000, which I'm a teacher, so that sounds like a lot of money. But if that doesn't sound like a lot to you, multiply it times 20 to get some sense of what that would buy. Now, she was a very wealthy woman by the time she wrote this will in 1816. Canal stocks and bank stocks and all this really profitable stuff. And so you probably have a reasonable question in your mind, which is, who did she leave this money to? Well, by the time she wrote her will in 1816, John Quincy Adams was on his way in politics, but his brother Thomas was not doing so well. She also had nephews who were really struggling. and grandson, some of whom were really in trouble financially. So there were all these guys in her life who needed that money, and she left them nothing. Nothing. She left it all to her nieces and her daughters-in-law, her female servants, her granddaughters. She left it all to women. And I think one reason she did that was because a lot of these women that she left this property to, they were the same thing she was. That is, they were married women. So in the eyes of the prevailing law, they had no more right to receive this property than she did to give it. And I think that's precisely her point. A, they were needy like their husbands, but then B, she was giving them the opportunity. And I'm sorry to say, I haven't found any evidence that any of them availed themselves of it, but I don't know that they didn't either. She was, having spent all these decades claiming to own property in defiance of the law, she was now giving these female relatives of hers the opportunity to do the same thing. Now, one of those female relatives was kind of her frenemy. This is Louisa Catherine Adams, who was had married her son, John Quincy Adams, and so she would later become First Lady. And, you know, they were very cordial with each other, but they had some issues too, you know, as one often does with one's daughter-in-law or mother-in-law or father-in-law and so forth. And so Louisa said something that I thought was kind of cheap after Abigail died. What she did was she did keep half of the money that Abigail sent her. The other half she set aside as a bequest to be divided among her three sons. And the kind of catty, I'll use that word, phrase she said was, they have a better title to it than I can boast. And that sounds modest, but it's also saying to Abigail, you know, screw you, we're not going to listen to you. They should have gotten the money, not me. So she's sort of defying Abigail's wishes to give it to all women. But here's my point, that when Louisa Catherine Adams, who was married, distributed this $150, again, multiply it times 20, so $3,000 to her three sons, when Louisa Catherine Adams made the decision to give the money to them, Louisa Catherine was also doing exactly what Abigail wanted to do, which is claiming the right, although a married woman, to own and distribute property. So she kind of tricked her. All right, last thing to say about the will. I read it to you, and you caught on this, Colleen. She goes, by and with his consent. It says that in Abigail's handwriting, but John Adams' signature is nowhere to be found on this document. So, you know, I could claim to be doing something with Harry Styles' consent, or, you know, I could make stuff up. Just because she claims it's with his consent, it has no legal validity. And this is my final point, is that when John, who lived another 8 years after Abigail died until 1826, died on July 4th, 1826, same as Jefferson, when he found this document in her papers after her death, he would have been perfectly within his rights to throw it in the fire. It was not a legally binding document. What he actually did, though, was comply with it to the letter. And by complying with it, he made it a legal document and gave life to what she'd said about by and with his consent. And so here's John Adams, who had laughed at the Remember the Ladies letter, total sexist pig in 1776, and probably, and certainly still in many ways in the 19th century. Mercy Otis Warren criticized him in her History of the Revolution. So he said women shouldn't write history. So, you know, the same person can be two people. He was a male chauvinist pig in many ways, but in this way, he collaborated with Abigail. They're famous, Abigail and John Adams, for a whole lot of collaborations. But to me, the most exciting one is this one that hardly anybody's heard of, but it was one where she was the leader and he was the obedient follower, and thank God he was. So that's my official speech. And now let's hear your questions. I'll take a couple of the ones that Cindy mentioned first, and then take on some of the other ones. Oh, process. I love working outside. Oh, I have a especially fun answer to that. At least it's fun to me. I got to go back in my slides. Do you remember I said that she invested in this land on this remote lake called Lake Magog? I'll bet you not many people listening have heard of it. But anyway, so when I was working on this book, I live in South Carolina, and at the time I had 2 young kids and a very supportive spouse. And so I said, I got to get away. I'm never going to finish this book if I don't go spend 2 weeks in a campsite with no video, with no electronic hookups or any of that stuff, and just go to town on this book. So I got out the map and found a spot way up in Vermont, not knowing about Abigail's speculation in Vermont, and found a campsite and spent a couple of weeks there. Really made a lot of progress on the book. And it was only later that I discovered that I was up there for 2 weeks writing my biography of Abigail Adams on land that Abigail Adams had owned. Oh, this was right in that tract where she had speculated.
That's amazing.
So anyway, I like to. This is a great thing about laptops. We're still waiting for a good one that'll work, that it can handle glare. But if you don't mind working in the shade, you can tape your laptop to a campsite or to the top of K2 or wherever you want to go. And I love doing that. You know, to use technology, which can be so confining, as a liberation. But what were some of those other questions?
Okay, of all the historical American women, why Abigail Adams?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question, because there are great biographies of Abigail Adams. Phyllis Levin wrote one. I can't remember any of the titles because they're all kind of boring titles like mine. But that's my favorite. It's by Phyllis Levin. Another guy actually named Charles Akers wrote one. And I like to think that just as Joris Kearns Goodwin has proved that women can write great biographies of men, that Charles Akers, and to a lesser extent I, have proven that men can write biographies of women. But anyway, so I would recommend Phyllis Levin's and Charles Akers' biographies. And I would not have also decided to write about her with all those other good ones out there. There's another one that I'm forgetting. I'll remember her name in a second and tell you. She wrote a book called Portia. That's a biography of Abigail Adams, because that was the pen name that she used. Portia, Portia. And I'm really embarrassed to forget her name. I'll look it up on Amazon in a second if I have to. Or actually, will you do that for me, Colleen? Will you just go to Amazon and look up Portia, and it'll pop right up, because I'm getting old. But anyway, so why write another one? I had I'd always been fascinated like everybody else in her, but I had no pretensions to write a biography until I was doing that previous book on bond speculators in the Constitution. And it was pretty esoteric and dry. And in order to show how I thought bond speculators influenced the movement for the Constitution and make that not too boring for my readers, I really need to find one of them to kind of use as a personification of all the others. You know, I'd use his story to really illustrate what was going on with all the others. And the problem was I'd find one guy's letters and another guy's account books and another guy's receipts or something, and I could never find one person who had all of those, who was really well documented. And finally I found my guy, and my guy was Abigail Adams. She was the best. So as far as I've been able to tell so far, of all these thousands of people who speculated in government securities, the one who was the best recorded was her. So that got me interested in her, of course. And then when I saw her use that line, I mean, I can remember the moment and the color of the wallpaper when I was sitting in the library, and she wrote, "This money which I call mine," and that's when I knew I had to make a book out of it.
Colleen found the name Edith Gellis.
Thank you. Yeah, Gellis, Gelles. Thank you.
Okay. Speaking of, I'm going to go to some questions the people have put in. And by the way, Corinne Keys Fairfax has answered 2 questions correctly that you posed. So kudos to Corinne.
Oh, Corinne.
Yeah,
nice.
She's wonderful. But I'll read her entire question. The famous quote, "Remember the ladies. I found your interpretation interesting. Most comments about this engagement with John Adams put Abigail as advocating for women's rights. However, you present this comment as more about men's total control over every aspect of women's lives and the potential for abusive husbands. What in your research made you go this route for the meaning of her comment?"
Okay, thanks, Corinne. That's a wonderful question. Well, I'm glad that Colleen produced Eve Gallus's name, because I think she's the person who really pioneered this thought. Another author named Joan Gunderson, who wrote a wonderful book about women in general in the Revolution, also really convinced the rest of us of what I'm about to say, which is, if you read the Remember the Ladies letter, and by the way, if you just Google in quotation marks Remember the Ladies, you can be reading a letter right now while I'm talking. If you read that letter, Abigail Adams complains about the fact that women don't have the right to vote and can't hold office and so forth, but she doesn't ask for the right to vote. She jokes around about leading a rebellion. I think she's like me, that, you know, when I go into my boss to ask for a raise, I do it jokingly first. "I sure could use a 15% raise, ha ha ha." And if she doesn't laugh, then I proceed to say, "I really do need it." And Abigail was very clever about using humor as the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. But anyway, she threatens a rebellion jokingly, and she complains about not having the right to vote, but she doesn't ask for the right to vote. The thing she really asks for is some kind of legal control over abusive husbands. That's really that's not obvious in the letter. I mean, I read it many times and didn't see it, but I really give a lot of thanks to Joan Gunderson in her book called To Be Useful to the World, which really sums up how 18th century women were trained to think, and I think in most cases did think, not what I can get for me, looking out for number one, but how to be useful to the world. So Gunderson and Gallus and a few others convinced the rest of us that's really what she's talking about, is abusive husbands. And she starts off by flattering John, saying, "Of course, you've not been abusive to me in any way, not verbally, not in any way. But not all husbands are like you. There are some terrible ones out there." And I don't remember the exact line right now, but don't put such unrestrained power in the hands of husbands. That's really what she was looking for. And so I don't mean to take a negative spin on it, except to say that that she didn't get, it's not like Congress, Congress didn't really interfere in internal affairs the way it does now. Some of us think that's a great thing, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Other people think it's a terrible thing because Congress gets too involved in our affairs. But in that time, at that time, the Continental Congress really didn't get into domestic stuff like that. So it was up to the states, but none of the states really did anything for abusive women too. I shouldn't exaggerate. A few states made it easier for abused wives to obtain a divorce. It got a little bit easier in a few places for abused wives to divorce their husbands. So in that sense, you could say letters like this letter was not published till decades after her death. I'm so mad at her son, Charles Francis Adams, because he published a bunch of her letters around 1850, but not this one. And I think it was too cheeky. And he's afraid it would make her look like one of those women who ride motorcycles or something. If she was saying, "Remember the ladies," that was, even though she didn't ask for the right to vote, that was too cheeky in his eyes. But anyway, so this letter wasn't public, but that doesn't mean it wasn't influential, because letters got passed around. That's one reason they used pen names. She chose Portia, not from the Portia in Merchant of Venice, but the other Portia, Brutus's wife, which is kind of weird because, Brutus is famous for assassinating the leader, right? Julius Caesar. So it would be like a woman today calling herself Mrs. Lee Harvey Oswald. Naming yourself after an assassin's wife is a pretty weird thing to do. But, in her eyes, Brutus was a good assassin because he killed a tyrant. But anyway, these letters did circulate. That's why they used pen names, pseudonyms, like Portia. So actually, Corinne's convinced me to look at this letter again in light of, if men are having conversations, oral conversations, so not well recorded in the letters, about, our wives do have a point about this. We're the good guys. We don't abuse our spouses, but we know about others who are abusers, and we really should make it easier for them to get divorces. And you could say that very indirectly, this letter was successful. Let me say one more thing about it. It's a longer answer than you wanted, but I'm very sorry to say that for those of us who believe there is such thing as an alcohol gene, that alcoholism, it can be genetic. It's not destiny, but it's a predisposition. I believe that, and I believe it's the case with the Smith family. That is her father's family. Her father was not an alcoholic, but one of her uncles was, and her brother definitely was. Two of her sons were. One of them definitely died of alcoholism. That's Charles. He died of being good looking because they spoiled him. I mean, everyone talked about how precious and cute he was. And I get into arguments with my wife, Gretchen. I shouldn't say this in front of 100 people, but because we have a beautiful son too, and I think she spoils him. And I keep saying, "Look what happened to Charles Adams." But anyway, she gets. Go ahead.
Karen Kennard, I think her name is. What was her opinion of John Adams's contemporaries? Who did she like, and who did she not trust of our founding fathers?
I'm so glad Karen Kennard asked that question, because the short answer is that it changed, because John was kind of fickle, or you might say flexible, and he loved Thomas Jefferson, and then he hated Thomas Jefferson, and then he loved him again. And he loved Franklin at first. Actually, he never reconciled with Franklin. So John would go back and forth on different people, but John had a lot of enemies whom he hated. And a lot of you have seen the HBO series called John Adams, and there's a lot that I love about that. Although my cynical advice about that is watch it with the sound off, because the sets are great, the costumes are great, but it never mentions any of Abigail's interest in women's rights. And it portrays her as like June Cleaver. That is, John gets all bug-eyed, and that's what made, what's his name? Who's that guy who played John Adams? Anybody remember? Somebody will write it in. But he has these bugged out eyes. And so he's a great person to play John Adams, who's quite passionate. Paul Giamatti played him. But they always depict Abigail sort of standing behind John, massaging his neck and calming him down. And I know Abigail Adams, I think, better than that from reading her letters. Here's the point. Everybody that John Adams hated, and at various times he hated John Hancock, Ben Franklin, even kind of George Washington, as much as one could, and Thomas Jefferson, John. Everybody that John hated, Abigail hated more. And we all know that from our own spouses. My spouse has had some dreadful bosses over the years, and I hated them more than she did because I had to hear about them all the time. And so she was really a passionate person. Maybe they thought it would be sexist in the movie to portray her as getting all passionate, but she was extremely passionate.
So what you're saying is, like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, since John had issues with them, sometimes she did too. So she really wasn't fond of any of them.
Whenever he had issues with somebody, she had them times 10. And that even extended to France. John got into as president, got into a naval war against France. Fortunately for everybody, it only took place at sea, and nobody landed troops on anybody's territory. But she wanted to make it a full-on war. She hated the French by that time, and lots of reasons to hate them, the guillotine and so forth. But he was the calmer one in war, and his opponents knew that, and knew that she was the one sort of pushing for war with France.
Okay, Mary Ann Price has a question, and this is one that makes sense to me too. Did Abigail Adams have more education than women were generally exposed to at that time? I think she means by reading books. Did she study math? Clearly she could write well.
You and I say clearly she could write well. I love reading her letters. She would disagree. and she would constantly berate herself for not writing well in both senses of that phrase. That is, for not having beautiful handwriting. I mean, you know, I've been reading 18th century stuff my whole career, so it's easy enough for me to read. But it's George Washington does have much better handwriting, and just for clarity's sake. But then also write well. I think she's a beautiful stylist, but she didn't think so. And so you might just say that women at the time were trained to look down on themselves. So she's sort of doing the, you know, what I associate today with the Midwest, you know, excessive Midwestern modesty thing. But for whatever reason, she never gave herself the credit she deserved. But that leads to the question of her education. And I want to say a couple of things about that. She had a little bit of schooling as a child, but was painfully conscious of the fact that her brothers got to go to Harvard and she didn't, and wrote one of her cousins who went there and really expressed something that you could call proto-feminist about, wish I could go to Harvard. You know, she said it in the nicest way she could, and not the way that women would later when they finally got into Harvard by demanding it. But she clearly was self-conscious about not having that formal education. But she was self-educated like Benjamin Franklin. But I really want to stress something else. And I borrow a term from my favorite historian, whose name is Laurel Ulrich. She talked about social medicine, that is the local medicine that would be practiced by so-called amateurs, which was often better than the doctors, you know, who would come in and put a leech on you or bleed you in various ways and use forceps to deliver your baby when they were totally unnecessary and might puncture your uterus, all this stuff. You know, social medicine was so much better. And also the doctor they didn't wash their hands. It was a mess. So anyway, she was a big advocate. She kind of became an advocate, Laurel Ulrich did, in her beautiful Pulitzer Prize winning book, Midwife's Tale for social medicine. What I saw with Abigail Adams and her friends was social education. And what I meant by that was that they would write letters saying, oh, I just read a Moliere poem, a Moliere play, and it was outrageous. You know, he was kind of ribald and dirty. And they would say, it was too dirty for me. And they'd say in great detail about what was so dirty about it that they thought was so shocking. But my point is, she had one cousin that she would write these letters to, where I would talk about what I liked and disliked about a Moliere poem. Then you would add your opinion about this Moliere poem, then bring up a Shakespeare play, and it'd go back and forth. The cousin lived next door. But they're writing letters back and forth anyway, because they're using each other to practice their letter writing, both as in handwriting as in stylus. And so it's not correct to describe Abigail Adams as only, she was self-educated, but she was also socially educated. That is, young women educated each other.
Brucey, I don't know who that is, but did she make money on that land? What happened to it?
Yes, the family held on to it. You know, they did acquire one thing from their father, John Adams, which is, once you own land, it's like me with books. Once you own land, never sell it. And they held on to it well into the 19th century. But by the time they sold it, the New Yorkers had been kicked off, and Vermont was admitted, as everybody knows, as the 14th state in the 1790s. And then B, more people came up there and settled it. You know, Vermont's hilly, but it's really, a lot of it is really good land. And you can do dairy, as they still do, thus Ben and Jerry's. And so it's good land, and they sold it in the 19th century at a nice profit.
Lisa Helene Lawson, what in her upbringing gave her the talents and skills to handle financial affairs with such an expertise as some of the men educated in law and finance of the day?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to give an answer to it that completely contradicts the answer I just gave, so you figure it out. Buy my book and maybe it'll help, but read her letters, that'll help more. And what I'm going to say is that she had, at least ceremonially, she had this self-deprecating thing I called Midwestern about, oh, I'm a poor worm. It's also Christian, you know. I'm writing about a woman named Sarah Osborne, and she always described herself as a worm. But this worm was like conquering empires. As she was a missionary, and she was bringing people to Christ, and she was defying men. And, you know, that was a pretty darn powerful worm. Anyway, and that's kind of Abigail too. That is that she went through the motions of self-deprecation, but deep down she was quite self-confident. Somebody once asked me, what would Abigail Adams say about 9/11? And I was tempted to say, well, that's a dumb question. But then I remembered she had read the Quran, which was something the person asking me that question, I didn't call him on it, but I bet he'd never read the Quran, and she had at least excerpts of it. And because she quoted it in a love letter to John back when she was Abigail Smith in around 1762, she said, I wish I could come to you on the Abrak of Muhammad. And of course, I had to look that up, but it's like a winged horse, like a Pegasus that Muhammad could fly around on. So she was a really well-educated person through this social education, and I think a really confident person. That remember the ladies letter, a teacher in Colorado once did me a favor and looked up the number of imperative verbs in that. And there's 8 imperative verbs in 2 paragraphs. Imperative verbs as in command verbs. As subtle as she was commanding. Remember the ladies is itself an imperative verb, at least if you take it out of context like that. So she beautifully mastered that self-deprecation and at the same time self-confidence. And by the way, you didn't ask what attracted her to John or John to her, but I think it was that. He really liked her self-confidence. He knew that he had an ego problem and he needed somebody who could give as well as she got, and he found the one who could.
Margaret O'Connor just wants to share this with you. She lives in Quincy, and his descendants built a carriage house at the edge of their property that now runs along Newport Avenue. They did this because the city kept taking the land by eminent domain. This is where the White House is and John Quincy Adams Library is. So she wants you to know that.
I'm glad for other people to know that, but I know it because I've been in that carriage house. It's very cool.
Susan wants to know, did her uncle Isaac Smith assist her with financial decisions?
No, a different uncle. Isaac Smith, let's see, was he an uncle or a cousin? One of the Isaac Smiths that she was related to, I think it was her uncle. Maybe it was her cousin. Anyway, there was an Isaac Smith that was her great friend, and I think he was the one who wrote that letter about how come I can't come to Harvard, basically. He became a loyalist, and we all know that April 19th, 1775 was Lexington and Concord. He actually directed the British reinforcements how to get to Lexington in a hurry. So how far they diverged. But no, the uncle who was her financial advisor, at least initially, was Cotton Tufts, for whom Tufts University is named. But let me add on one quick thing to that. I said he was her economic advisor, which is true at first, but by the 1790s, he was writing her for investment advice.
Okay. Whoops, I need that one to go away. Okay. What was her relationship with her children? You talked about one time she spread, but they all seemed, that was an odd family, I have to say. They were difficult sometimes.
Great way to put it. And didn't you ask me a question, something about which of the first ladies would I as my mother or something like that? I'll take it this as that, and it is a toughie because this is one of the things that made this such a fun book to write. My three previous books, there was really a team that I was rooting for. For instance, when you write about enslaved people, it's hard to see the slaveholders' point of view. And I tried to, but really I'm rooting for the enslaved people because they were so oppressed. And likewise in my other books. And what was fun about writing about Abigail Adams, and this may shock some of the people, and they may disagree, which is one of the fun things about history, but I find myself loving her on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and hating her on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Hating her because this bond speculation business was a dirty, dirty business. You have people like Joseph Plum Martin. And by the way, Google that, history buffs, Joseph Plum with a B on the end, Martin. And you can read his memoirs of fighting for 7 years in the Continental Army at the end of that 7 years. And he was at many of the hardest battles and suffered at Valley Forge and so forth. Just really a brutal 7 years. He started at age 15. So technically he's 22 and is over, but he must have felt like he was 66. Anyway, they gave him bonds at the end of the war, and he needed money just to get home. And all of his bonds he sold to a speculator for just enough money to pay for a suit of clothing and the money he needed to pay for food and housing on the way home. And the speculators were just unscrupulous, in my opinion.
Mhm.
She didn't buy the bonds directly from the soldiers, so maybe you could say she had an arm's length transaction going there. But so anyway, that's one thing to not like about her. Another thing to not like about her is that she vetoed 3 of her children's marriage partners. 3 of them had a guy or a gal that they wanted to marry, and she and John said no. And all 3 ended up with a less good spouse, in my opinion. John Quincy, when he was just getting started as a lawyer, fell in love with a 16-year-old merchant's daughter from, I think, Gloucester, Massachusetts. 16 wasn't as young as it is now. And the parents didn't dislike her and didn't think the fact that she was 16 and he was 25 or whatever he was, didn't think that was such a big problem, but they said it's too soon. That is, you don't have a lot of clients.
Right.
You need to get yourself established first, and then you can think about finding somebody that you love. And she moved on, and he moved on, and he married Louisa Catherine Adams. And it's just heartbreaking to see the letters that he wrote to her about, you've always been the woman I've loved second most in the world after Rebecca. And they were great partners, he and Louisa Catherine Adams, and they did love each other and did wonderful things. And she's really cool. There's a wonderful book about her traveling across Russia alone at one point. So she was a real badass. I love her. But he didn't love her as much as Rebecca because mom and dad. Oh, and here's the thing about that. Guess what Mr. and Mrs. Smith had said to Abigail in 1762, 3-4, and that is, you can't marry this Adams fella because although someday maybe he'll be a decent lawyer, he doesn't have enough clients yet. And so she had defied her mother in marrying a lawyer with few clients, and yet she wouldn't let her own daughter, or wouldn't let her own son do the same thing, with really tragic results. And then her daughter, Nabby, was going to marry. I can understand the parents' call on this one. He was a playwright, and you never want your kid to marry a playwright. And so they vetoed that one. But instead, Nabby, or also called Abigail, but we call her Nabby by her nickname to distinguish them. She married a guy named William Smith, which we don't like because there's too many damn William Smiths in that family tree already. But he ended up being a problem because he was a gambler, both a literal gambler, and also he gambled in bonds, he gambled in land. And you see all these hilarious, to me, although darkly hilarious, letters that Abigail wrote in the 1790s saying, oh boy, your husband, Abigail Jr., Nabby, your husband is a speculator. You got to get him to stop speculating. And I go, Abigail, how did you make your fortune? You made it as a speculator. But of course, it ain't speculation if you're good at it. And she was, and he wasn't. And the family ended up having to live way out in upstate New York. And so when Nabby got breast cancer and had to come east to Boston for a mastectomy, which, in those days performed without, there was laudanum, which was opium, but it didn't deaden the pain very much. And it was a horrific procedure, which she went through, so awake, and it was not successful, and she later died. But it's hard enough to travel from, I think she must have been somewhere near where Rochester is now, somebody might correct me, and had to travel on a bumpy carriage with bad springs all the way to Boston to get to her mother and to her doctor with advanced stage breast cancer. And none of that would have happened if her mother and her father had allowed her to marry the guy she loved, because he was much more financially successful. And they
Speaking,
also cast with one of the other, that's enough though. Go ahead.
speaking of her, Kim says, I was surprised to read about her concern with her daughter having children so close together, suggesting she spaced them farther apart, suggesting methods of birth control.
Yeah, breastfeeding. They were really big into breastfeeding as a birth control technique. People on this call can probably tell us that it kind of works, but only kind of. It doesn't always work. But it's, you know, it works better than not doing it. So a lot of women did prolong their breastfeeding for that reason, so that they could space them out.
And Mary D asked, did Nabby die as a result of breast cancer after having a mastectomy?
Correct.
Cancer finally got her years later.
Yeah, mastectomy, you know, they didn't catch it in time, you know, as we know. That happened to a friend of mine too, so it's still happening.
With Abigail's will, did she write it by herself, or did she ask someone to help her draw it up, or did she think, and Corinne also wants to know, did she think she might outlive her husband?
When she wrote it in January of 1816, she was real sick and she thought she was dying. And so certainly when she wrote the will, she did not think she would outlive her husband. And you know, the by and with his consent part is important to that too, because that implies that she thinks he's going to outlive him. Because again, had she been a widow, she never was, but had she been a widow, she would have had a perfect right to write a will and do whatever she wants in it. But no, she expected to die first. She didn't die when she thought she was going to in January of 1816. She died 2 years later. Whether she had help, all I can tell you is I have no evidence that anybody helped her. It's a good question. It's in her handwriting, but you know, she's sitting right there. John, you know, as you know, in those days, men retired. So people always talk about the period beginning with March 1800, and writing about John Adams, you know, the retirement years. And they were the retirement years for John, but they weren't the retirement years for Abigail. So he had long since retired, but he is a great lawyer, just ask him. And so I would not be surprised if he advised her on, and you know, I read that line by and with his consent. I believe her when she said that he had consented to it. So it's not like he was surprised. I'm guilty of deception for dramatic effect and saying when she found this and when he found this in her papers. You know, we all find things in our spouses' papers, but I don't think he was shocked when he found it. He probably had helped. He had probably advised her on the language, but I don't know.
Tina Dudley. It is my understanding that Thomas Jefferson and Abigail wrote back and forth. What was their relationship?
Oh, Jefferson and Abigail. I'm glad you asked, because remember I said John and Jefferson were good buddies, worked on the Declaration of Independence together, and then they were and also collaborated in France for a while when they overlapped as diplomats. And you know, they were both into the Enlightenment and wrote about those subjects and religious liberty, things like that. But then they became big enemies during the 1790s when Adams was one of the leading Federalists and is elected basically as the Federalist candidate for president in 1796 to start serving in 1797. And Jefferson is the opposite of that. And, you know, the Federalists were for a strong central government, loose interpretation of the Constitution. They were kind of pro-North, meaning no pro-manufacturing and things like that, and pro-Britain, whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans were pro-South, pro-France, because the South generally trades with France and for other reasons. And they're a little more democratic to men, less democratic to women, by the way, as a story named Rosemarie Zagari revealed. But anyway, so they were bitter partisan enemies. And as I said, Abigail followed and outdid John at hating Jefferson. But then long after both Jefferson and actually there was a brief, what do you call it? A brief rapprochement when John wrote them a beautiful letter. I think it was after Nabby died. Oh no, after Jefferson's daughter died, right. John wrote a very sweet letter. And you could see that they were ready to make up, but Abigail wasn't. And she really never did. She had a few more letters with Jefferson, but Oh, the Jefferson Adams correspondence in their last couple of decades on Earth is amazing. And, there's an edge to it. They're both trying to get credit for everything that happened during the Revolution. And they're both, one of the things they share is their feeling that Franklin and Washington got too much credit for everything. But those are wonderful letters. But Jefferson and Abigail Adams never patched up in the way that Jefferson and John Adams did.
This is a question away from the beginning. Donna Atkinson, spelling was not standardized at Abigail Adams' time. Was it a focus in the education of males?
No. This is one of my challenges as a teacher is, kids texting has ruined spelling. And so we all browbeat our students to spell properly, but then also we browbeat them to misspell properly when they're quoting somebody, because we really want to faithfully reproduce the 18th century prose. And that's hard because a lot of people think, oh, they capitalized nouns, but that's not true. I mean, they were more likely to capitalize a noun than anything else, but you read the Declaration of Independence. I challenge somebody can prove me wrong, and I'd love it if they did, because it's something I'm writing about now, but I can't find any pattern other than, a slight tendency to capitalize. Sometimes they'll capitalize the first letter of a sentence. Often they'll capitalize a noun, but beyond that, it's random.
Nancy
there
asked,
were things like Johnson's Dictionary. Where's Nancy? You probably only have
Nancy
a few more.
has a question.
I'll stay all night.
Okay, what
I don't know
was
where they are though. This is the
what was
for me.
Abigail Adams' relationship with Mercy Otis Warren?
That one went through some strain too. Mercy begins as Abigail's real mentor. I remember I was applying for a job once, and there were two people in the department where I was applying, I won't say where, who hated each other. And I finally asked the younger of them, what's going on between you and Bob? And she goes, I used to be his protege, and then I disagreed with him on something. And that happens. Some of the worst enemies, I hope none of my mentors is watching, but some of the worst enemies are where they're great collaborators, and then the mentor starts to grow into their own, and then the protege gets left behind and is jealous and of how come I didn't get to win the Pulitzer Prize or whatever. That happened with them. That is that Mercy, Abigail really admired Mercy the same way she admired, there was a famous woman, historian at the time. Somebody write in because I've forgotten.
Was it Catherine Macaulay?
Thank you, Cindy. Catherine Macaulay, who she really admired. Yeah. And then Catherine Macaulay ended up having a scandalous life. She married the pool boy basically after her husband died, a guy a third her age. Guys could do that, but gals couldn't, But anyway, she stopped hanging out with Catherine Macaulay when she became Catherine Macaulay Sawbridge, but she also broke with Mercy. She just got a little too big for Mercy, and also Mercy, as I said, became critical of John Adams because Mercy and her husband James both opposed the U.S. Constitution. People forget it today when we all fall over ourselves to be bigger supporters of the Constitution, that when it was adopted, about half of Americans, of free white men that could vote, opposed it. And Mercy Warren was one of them. Elbridge Gate, she wrote essays against the Constitution. Abigail and John's son, John Quincy Adams, initially was skeptical, and then he came around very quickly on the Constitution. But the Warrens and the Garys never did. And so Mercy Otis Warren, people know her as a playwright and poet, but she was also a great historian, maybe best, in I'd say, as a historian. And she really gave it to John Adams in her history of the Revolution.
Well, he didn't speak kindly of her either. I don't think.
Oh no! I told you, women do not quote this out of context. But he said women shouldn't write history. He never said that until she criticized him.
Okay. Janice Dixon, would John and Abigail have known about Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings? And if so, what would they have thought of it?
Okay, where is Janice Dixon? I'm not asking because of that question, but it's just more fun for me if I know. Aren't we all over the country here?
Janice, can you type in where you live?
Oh, we don't have to wait for Janice. But Colleen, will you collect a bunch of them for me? Just because it's fun for me to know that these questions are coming. If a bunch of people,
Yes, we will get you that list.
But anyway,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
we can do.
Callie Hemmings' question first while you're doing that. To some extent, yes, because it was in the newspaper. That's it was something that was rumored about at the time among the enslaved people at Monticello. She had all of these light-skinned kids, and so it was pretty clear that her partner was not African. Of course, she was pretty light-skinned herself because she was basically Thomas Jefferson's sister-in-law, or stepsister, I guess would be a better way to put it. Which is the better way to put it? Sister-in-law, because
she was his wife's stepsister.
Right. Thank you. So she was fairly light-skinned herself. Her father, kind of ironically, was a slave trader, but also fell in love, or as he saw it. She may or may not have seen it that way, but I think he probably thought he was in love with Elizabeth or Betty Hemings, and that was how we got Sarah or Sally Hemings. All the sources call her Sally Hemings, but Annette Gordon Reed, in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Hemingses of Monticello, makes the case that these diminutives like Betty and Sally are insulting, and so that we should call them what they would have been called if they had been free people and not subject to racism like Elizabeth and Sarah. It's an interesting thing to debate, and I'm not taking a position on it, but it's something to think about. But anyway, so the enslaved people at Monticello always believed that, and they passed that on to their children and grandchildren. And so you have families alive today that tell that story, but also some of those enslaved people lived long enough to tell their story to newspaper editors who wrote it down in the early, let's say in the 1830s and 40s. And, it's a pretty unique and interesting thing to have been once owned by Thomas Jefferson. And so if the local newspaper editor where you're living, say in Ohio, because a lot of them did move to Ohio, he allowed them to run away, basically. That is these people that he was obviously related to in some way. We're not sure which way, or maybe multiple ways. But anyway, so one of them, for instance, named Isaac Jefferson, in particular, did that, told his story to a newspaper editor who wrote it all down. So you have the enslaved people, they know it. And then B, it got into the Federalist newspapers. People worry, understandably, January 6th, 2021 happened. We're worried about over excessive partisanship today between the red states and the blue states, between the Trump people and the Biden people and so forth. But a lot of people make the mistake of thinking this battle is something new. Mm-hmm. But in the 1790s, it was worse. It was worse. I guess, some people have died in this partisan battle. Sometimes protests have gotten out of hands between Black Lives Matter versus the Proud Boys, and on January 6th, we lost a police officer too, if you count the one who committed suicide, and the protesters trampled one of their own people, another of their people had a heart attack, another one got shot by a cop as she approached within a few feet of senators or House members. And so people have died in our violent partisan conflicts, but people died in those violent partisan conflicts of the 1790s. And the newspapers were just like, if you think of your most partisan cable channels, I guess MSNBC and Fox News, they didn't have anything on the newspapers of the 1790s. They were much more scurrilous than the worst commentator you can think of on, not as bad as some of the guys I listened to once in a while on AM radio, but they were as bad as anything worse than anything on broadcast news in accusing them of having bastard children as they would have put it, and so forth. And so the Sally Hemings story was one of those stories that was out there. They didn't use the name Sally or Sarah Hemings. They didn't use her last name at all. They didn't acknowledge that she had one, but they definitely talked about the light-skinned kids walking around and working at Monticello and implied that they were his. Oh, and one other source, there were a bunch of travelers. It was the standard thing to do if you're a wealthy person, especially if you're a French aristocrat. Just as we all go to Monticello today as tourists, they went as visitors of Jefferson. It's one reason he bought and built Poplar Forest down off the beaten track, was because he got sick of all the visitors he got. But the visitors were there to observe, and some of them rode up seeing these light-skinned people, one of whom, I can't remember, it was one of the French aristocrats who said, there's a guy that I saw, one of the slaves, I saw at sunset, sort of standing next to Thomas Jefferson in profile, and they had the same exact face. So there was all this talk at the time. And Annette Gordon Reed, in her first book, which doesn't get as much attention as Hemings's Monticello, called Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, she made the point that the story has always been there among the Black descendants, even as the white descendants always denied it. And the point she made that in that book, which was before the DNA, was how come we believe the white descendant stories and not the Black descendant stories? And I think she had a point there.
We read the book Jefferson's Daughters by Catherine Carrison.
Oh, great.
So,
right. Yeah. I have not read it myself yet, but I hear it's fantastic, and it's got 2 white daughters and 1 black daughter, right?
You had asked about from where people come, and some of them have written in Fairfax, Virginia, Tampa, Florida, Illinois, North Carolina. So we've got some.
That is so cool. A strong East Coast preference. Are we going to have to do this again for the West Coast audience like they used to do on?
No, and somebody just put in she's from Minneapolis. No, they're from all over. They're from all over.
That's what I mean about Midwestern self-denial. Oh, I'm a poor
Fresno, California. Doylestown, PA.
Oh,
they're putting them in now.
Cool. See, this is what I can't do when I go to a VFW.
Minnesota,
hall.
Michigan, Atlantic City, Kansas. They're all putting them in now. Tennessee, Colorado.
Oh, that's so cool. That's
New Jersey. So they're from, I
wanna
can't say them all.
Are non-JAR members allowed to come to these books? Because I'd love to come.
No. West Virginia, Oregon, North Carolina, Massachusetts, New Jersey, West Virginia. I can't read them all. Tennessee, Fort Lauderdale, Kentucky.
That's enough. That's very
okay. They're all over now.
Couple years.
Okay, here's our last question. Maybe we'll see who else pipes in. This is the one that I really want to know. Would you want Abigail Adams to be your friend had you lived at that time?
Oh, yes. Now that is how you asked at the beginning, and I remembered it as mother, because mother, I say no. It's just too much and too much expectation, because all 3 of those boys were supposed to be president, sort of one after the other. It's one reason so many people hated John Adams, as opposed to Jefferson and Washington, who were president before and after him. One of the great things about Jefferson and Washington was no legitimate male heirs. There was no danger of a Washington dynasty or a Jefferson dynasty because there was no son. There were black sons in Jefferson's case, but they weren't fully acknowledged, and they weren't going to become president. And they both and Jefferson had daughters. Of course, Washington didn't even have daughters. He had step kids, all of whom he sadly, he and Martha both outlived all 4 of her children. But anyway, so the question was not about whether would you want, because you may know Cindy. Where are you, Cindy, by the way?
I'm in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay, you don't know this, and I've come from a political family, and I never had pressure to go into politics, but it was kind of understood that would be a good thing for me to do, and I hate it for all the reasons that other people do. Plus, I can't remember names, and so I wasn't going to do well at it. And I'm so happy that both my sister, one of my sisters, and my brother did go into politics, and my sister also married a guy who's into politics, so they're kind of covering that. But anyway, there's a reason to not be her her. And also I was pretty happy to make my own choice of spouse. Thank you very much, which Abigail and John wouldn't have allowed me to do. But would I want as a friend? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, I haven't read the Quran. And so I'd love to have a friend who has and can talk to me about it. And so, yes, I would rank her. Jefferson, for all his flaws, was brilliant and beautifully well read. It's such a great writer. But Franklin, do you know one thing Franklin did? This has nothing to do with with Abigail Adams. I don't know where Barbara came into mind, but one thing Franklin did in his will, he left some money to be lent out to artisans to help them get started for 100 years, which was a great thing to do. But then and they were paying interest on this money, so the fund got bigger and bigger over the course of the 19th century. And then it was given to the cities of Philadelphia and Boston to do something good with. And I forget, what did Philadelphia do? I think Philadelphia may have used it for the library, something good. But Boston founded an industrial institute where young men, and now men and women, can go to learn higher order industrial work. For instance, to fix locomotives. And I have a friend, and it just floored me when I learned this from my buddy. I knew him, our daughters were friends, and so we were. And I'm pretty sure he makes more than me, because he's got this very technical skill of making locomotives go again. And he's in a union and all of that. And so he makes a ton of money coming from a working class family. He got that skill at the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology in Boston. And so I don't know. I guess I'd rank them Franklin, and then Abigail Adams, and then Jefferson. If I could with one of them, I'd rank them in that order.
Well, good. This has been wonderful. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. I will announce that the person you chose will win we have a thing. The reason we're doing this is we're getting ready for the 250th anniversary of our country. So we want to learn about the people that were there at the beginning. And we have this, it's America 250 pin. It's just a little pin. So that's going to go out to Gail Klein. I will send that to her. And I have a present to send to you, but I will get your address. And
cool.
I will get your address from you. And then anybody who wants his address can email to me. And I will put that on our Facebook page too, to email me. Who's typing?
You see what I've typed there?
Yes. Oh, yes. I can't say that. I say 250.
It's the word sesquicentennial, but this is a group that will join me. I'm so proud of myself for having coined this. We want to also make it a sister centennial. So remember.
Isn't that great? Sister Centennial. I will show, one of our honorary presidents general, Lynn Forty Young, is on the commission. She's a commissioner on the 250th America Commission. Cool. So I will tell her that. We'll share that with her. But thank you. I will get your address. This has been wonderful. For those of you who are still on, this is what we're reading next. Betsy Ross. I don't know if you know Marla Miller.
Oh, I just talked about it. She's the nicest person in the world. Is she coming on with you?
She's going to be here in May.
Oh, hey, can I come to just that one?
I will send you an invitation. I will send you an invitation. But you will have to work it so you can talk to her. But thank you so much.
For a long time, but she's so nice. She's so nice.
She's wonderful. Learning about Abigail, I have to say, when I read this book, I will show you mine. Look at all the paper clips. And it has all this yellow underlining, because you are a historical person, a history lover. You put it in there. So I thank you so much for coming on with us. I think everybody has enjoyed it, and keep writing. We're looking for your new book.
Well, Cindy, I'm going to be
The Fire Beneath.
PA. I've changed the title. Give me 1 second. I'm going to be in Western PA in I think August, giving a talk in Pittsburgh. So come in and let me meet you in person, and I'll sign that book and give you a copy of the new one.
Okay.
But for everybody, if I can steal the screen again real quick, just as we're leaving. I'll leave this on after we leave. I can't waste an opportunity to plug.
Yes. Oh,
that's-
this is a new book.
And you see, so this, let me zoom in on the cover here, because you see there's these two dudes on the horse are being stopped. They're British cavalrymen or messengers actually, and they're being stopped by this other dude standing up. See the picture? But the dude with the pistol who's holding them up, that's no dude, that's a lady.
Okay. Oh, then we'll have to read this. We'll have to read it. Liberty is Sweet. Now, this is on Amazon now?
You can pre-order now, but it'll really be there in October.
Okay.
And I'll bet some this thing in because she's so into this stuff, even though she's heard this all before. But there is a DAR member in a place called Liberty, Missouri, appropriately enough, named Riley Sutherland, who is my student assistant. She's in the Honors College at the University of South Carolina. And for the last year, she's been helping me on this book and really has been my co-author. For instance, she prepared the population table. You can now know the population of the Iroquois Indians and the Nevis, where Alexander Hamilton was born, and all of that thanks to Riley. He also prepared the 70-page bibliography and all of that. And she is a young and great DAR member who really helped me write this book.
I'm having a hard time. If she's a DAR member, do you spell it Sutherland, S-O-U or S-U?
S-U, like Donald Sutherland.
That's what I want. And Riley, is that her real name? Riley, R-I-L-E-Y?
Yeah. What do you mean, is that her real name? It's a good name.
Well, Cindy is my name, but it's not my real name. My real name is Cynthia, which I hate.
My real name's Linwood, but yes.
Oh, but somebody knows her. Somebody says, way to go, Riley. But if she's a DR member, I can find her and say that you gave her a plug.
Well, it's a necessary and deserved plug because she really got this book over. It's like, it was kind of like, you know, that movie, the Jamaican bobsled. She carried me.
Well, we thank you. I think everybody would share a big applause with me. We do shine hands in DAR.
So, you guys, a lot of fun for me.
We do. But thank you. And people will be in touch with me and they'll send their books to you with postage paid for you to send them back.
Yeah, so I don't care so much about the postage, but I want a self-addressed envelope so I don't bottleneck it.
I will make sure that that happens. So, sir, thank you. Dr. Woody Holton, author of Abigail Adams. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Everybody's writing thank you in the messages. So
you can hear from Fresno and Michigan and all these other, I'm going to Michigan on Monday, I think. But it was great to hear from so many places and fascinating questions. There are a lot of questions I've never gotten asked before, including all of yours, by the way, Cindy. So I'm going to try to copy them off the chat if I can after you all go. So thank you, everybody.
Take care and stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Okay. Yeah. Get that vaccine. Bye-bye. Abigail would want you to get the shot.
Okay.